me like a ghost in my own home while my sister lived like a queen in my stolen dreams. They thought throwing me out into the rain was the end of my story, but they didn't realize they were just giving me the freedom to become their worst nightmare. Watch how a discarded son built an empire from the mud and returned to collect every single debt with interest. Welcome back to Revenge Water Official. If you are enjoying the content and want to support the journey, then make sure you hit that subscribe button right now and turn on all notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support helps Revenge Water Official grow and bring you even better videos every single day, so join the family today by clicking subscribe, and thank you for being part of the team. The cold rain in Seattle never felt as heavy as it did the night my own father threw my suitcase onto the wet driveway and told me never to come back, while my sister stood behind him in the warm glow of the hallway holding the college fund that was supposed to be mine and smiling because she finally had it all. You think you are seeing a broken man standing here in the shadows, but what you are actually witnessing is the birth of a predator, because the pain they fed me for 20 years just became the fuel for a fire that is going to burn their entire world down. Stay right there, because you are about to see exactly how a discarded son turns a betrayal into an empire and makes every single person who doubted him beg for a seat at the table they kicked him away from. It started with the quiet realization that I was the ghost in my own home, a shadow that only existed to make my sister Maya look brighter. Every trophy I brought home was placed in a box in the garage, while her participation ribbons were framed on the mantle like holy relics. My parents, Leonard and Diane, had a way of looking through me as if I were a glitch in their perfect family portrait. I remember sitting at the dinner table on my 18th birthday waiting for a cake or even a simple happy birthday, only to listen to them discuss Maya's upcoming summer trip to Paris, which cost exactly what I had saved from my part-time job at the warehouse, money they had convinced me to put into a joint account for safekeeping. But when I asked about my savings, my father just set his fork down and looked at me with a coldness that still chills my bones. He told me that as a family we had to make sacrifices and that Maya had the social potential that I lacked, so the money was better spent on her networking than on my silly dreams of a business degree. I felt the first crack in my heart that night, but I stayed quiet because I still believed that if I worked harder and stayed loyal, they would eventually see my worth. I worked 80 hours a week after high school, taking every double shift and every dirty job no one else wanted, while Maya lived like a queen on my sweat and my parents' praise. I didn't realize then that they weren't just overlooking me, they were actively draining me to feed her ego. The breaking point came when I discovered a ledger in my father's office showing that he had been using my social security number to take out loans for his failing construction business, leaving me with a ruined credit score before I even had a chance to start my life. When I confronted him, he didn't apologize, he didn't even look ashamed, he just looked annoyed and told me that I owed him for the roof over my head and the food in my stomach. That was the moment the betrayal stopped being a bruise and became a deep, jagged wound. Maya walked in then wearing a brand new designer coat bought with the money they didn't have, and she laughed, telling me to stop being so dramatic because I was always the one who ruined the mood. She called me a loser who would never amount to anything more than a laborer, and my mother nodded in agreement, saying that maybe it was time for me to move out if I couldn't be a team player. That night the argument escalated until my father's hand met my face, and the force of it sent me stumbling into the hallway where they had already packed my things. It was calculated they had been waiting for an excuse to discard the bridge they used to cross over their debts. As I stood in that driveway soaking wet and looking at the locked door of the only home I had ever known, I felt a strange coldness settle over my soul. The tears stopped and a terrifying clarity took their place. I realized that love was a currency I didn't have, but power was something I could build from the mud beneath my boots. I looked at the dark windows of their house and whispered a vow to the rain that I would return one day, not as the son they rejected, but as the storm that would take everything back from them, starting with their peace of mind. I walked for miles that night, carrying my life in a single bag with only $40 in my pocket and a heart full of a dark, beautiful hunger for retribution. The city was huge and indifferent, but for the first time I felt free, because when you have nothing left to lose, you become the most dangerous person in the room. And I was done being the victim of a family that saw me as a bank account instead of a human being. I found a 24-hour diner and sat in the back corner, mapping out a life that didn't include mercy or weakness, because from this moment on every breath I took was dedicated to the art of the comeback and the slow, calculated demolition of the people who thought they could bury me and walk away smiling. The transition from a discarded son to a nameless shadow in the city was a descent into a private hell that none of them could have imagined. As I slept on the floor of a shipping container in the industrial district, listening to the rats crawl through the gaps, I didn't feel pity for myself. I felt a sharpening of my will that acted like a whetstone against a blade. Every morning I woke up at 4 a.m. when the world was still gray and cold, and I ran until my lungs burned and my legs shook because I knew that physical weakness was the first thing I had to kill. I found work at a scrapyard where the owner, a hardened man named Griffin, saw the look in my eyes and knew I wasn't there for a paycheck. I was there for a purpose. He paid me under the table and let me sleep in the back office surrounded by the smell of oil and rusted iron, and it was there in the silence of the night that I began to educate myself using the public library computers during my lunch breaks to study the very things my father had used to destroy me: finance, credit law, and the intricate mechanics of debt. I learned how the world really moved on invisible strings of capital and leverage. While my parents were busy spending the last of their credit on Maya's empty social life, I was building a foundation of knowledge that was impenetrable. I stayed invisible for 2 years, saving every cent and eating nothing but canned beans and water while my skin grew lean and my eyes grew hard. Like flint, I watched from the shadows of social media as Maya posted photos of her lavish parties and her fake friends wearing clothes that I knew were paid for by the interest on loans my father couldn't afford to pay back. I saw the cracks in their facade long before they did: the missed payments, the notices from the bank, the frantic attempts to maintain an image of wealth that was rotting from the inside out. And it made me smile, a slow dark smile, because I was the one who was going to buy those debts. I started small, using the few thousand I had saved to flip discarded electronics and machinery. Using the skills Griffin taught me, I had a knack for seeing value where others saw junk, and soon I had enough to move out of the scrapyard and into a small studio apartment that served as my command center. I worked 3 jobs by day and traded stocks and distressed assets by night, my mind becoming a high-speed processor dedicated to one goal: the total acquisition of my father's life. I remember the first time I saw them in public after 3 years. I was walking out of a high-end grocery store where I had started to buy better fuel for my body, and they were pulling into the parking lot in the same luxury SUV that was now battered and out of date. They didn't see me. I was just another man in a suit, but I saw them. I saw the way my mother's shoulders were hunched with stress and the way my father's hands gripped the steering wheel with a desperation that smelled like fear. Maya was in the back seat looking at her phone with a bored expression, oblivious to the fact that the very ground she stood on was shifting. I felt a surge of adrenaline, but I didn't confront them yet, because a king doesn't strike until the board is set. I needed more than just money. I needed the kind of power that could erase a person's legacy. I met a man named Elias, an old shark in the world of private equity, who saw my hunger and decided to mentor me, not out of kindness but because he recognized a fellow predator. He taught me how to find the jugular in a balance sheet and how to use shell companies to hide my movements. I became his protege, his ghost, and under his wing I made my first million by the age of 23 by shorting the very construction industry my father had failed in. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving on the chaos of the market, and every dollar I made was a nail in the coffin of their pride. I began to buy up the debt of small local contractors, and soon I found exactly what I was looking for. The primary lender for my father's business was a struggling regional bank that was looking to offload its bad paper. I used a holding company with a nameless face to purchase his entire portfolio of loans for pennies on the dollar. And just like that, I became my father's landlord and his executioner without him even knowing my name. I stood in my office overlooking the city skyline, holding the paperwork that gave me the power to seize his house, his equipment, and his future. And for a moment I remembered the rain on that driveway and the way they laughed while I bled, but I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt a cold professional satisfaction. The trap was set, and the bait was their own greed and arrogance. They thought they had discarded a loser, but they had actually unleashed a monster who now owned the air they breathed. And as I watched the sun set over the horizon, I knew that the next time they saw my face it would be the last thing they ever wanted to see, because the debt was due and I was coming to collect every single tear with interest. The day I signed the final papers to take control of their lives was the quietest day of my life. There were no trumpets or storms, just the scratch of a pen on parchment that signaled the end of their era and the beginning of my reckoning. I didn't send a bailiff or a lawyer to deliver the news because I wanted to see the color drain from their faces with my own eyes. I drove to the old neighborhood in a car that cost more than their entire house and pulled into the driveway where I had once been discarded like trash. The lawn was overgrown, and the paint was peeling, showing the reality of the decay they had tried so hard to hide with filters and lies. I walked up to the front door and knocked with a rhythmic, steady beat that felt like a heart stopping. I heard my mother's voice complaining about who could be at the door at this hour, and when she opened it she didn't even recognize me. At first she saw a man in a tailor-made charcoal suit with a watch that gleamed like a weapon and a face that had been hardened into a mask of cold precision. She started to give a polite, confused smile until her eyes met mine and the recognition hit her like a physical blow. She gasped and stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth as my father came around the corner asking what the fuss was about. When he saw me he froze, his face turning a sickly shade of gray while he tried to summon the old bluster. Every time they saw a skyscraper or a news report, They would remember the son they threw away and realize that they hadn't just lost a child, they had created their own greatest enemy, and now the real game was about to begin. The height of my success felt like standing on the edge of a frozen mountain where the air was thin and only the strongest could breathe while the world below was a blur of noise and insignificance. I had moved my operations into a glass tower that pierced the clouds, a monument to the boy who once slept in a shipping container, and every time I looked out of those floor-to-ceiling windows I saw a city that I had partially built and entirely mastered. My name was now whispered in boardrooms with a mixture of fear and respect, but the more I gained, the more the ghosts of my past tried to find a way back into the light. It started with a single handwritten letter from my mother delivered to my secretary. It was stained with tears and filled with the kind of manipulative poison that she used to call love. She spoke of her failing health and the way my father had become a shell of a man sitting in the dark and staring at the wall, wondering where it all went wrong. She had the audacity to ask for a meeting for a chance to explain and for a small loan to get them through the winter. I burned that letter in a crystal ashtray and watched the smoke rise, thinking about the winters I spent without a coat because they had spent the money on Maya's velvet dresses, but they were desperate now, and a desperate animal is either dangerous or pathetic, and they had become both. A week later they showed up at the lobby of my building looking like beggars in a cathedral of commerce. They were stopped by security, of course, and I watched them on the high-definition monitors in my office, seeing my father argue with a young guard. Definition monitors in my office, seeing my father argue with a young guard who wasn't even born when Leonard was a big fish in a small pond. I decided to let them up, not because I felt pity, but because I wanted to deliver the final killing blow to any hope they had of ever using me again. When the elevator doors opened and they stepped into my inner sanctum, they looked small and gray against the marble and gold. My father tried to straighten his shoulders and put on a mask of paternal pride, telling me that he always knew I had this spark in me, and that he was proud of the man I had become. The lie was so heavy it practically hung in the air like a foul odor. I let them speak for 10 minutes, listening to their rehearsed apologies and their excuses about how they were just trying to prepare me for the real world by being tough, and how Maya was the weak one who needed the help. They actually tried to rewrite history in front of the man who lived it. Maya wasn't with them. She was too ashamed, or perhaps too broken, to face the person she had stepped on for 2 decades, and I told them that their pride was a disgusting joke. I told my father that he didn't have a spark of pride in him, he had a spark of greed, and that he only saw me as a son now because I was the only person who could stop the debt collectors from taking the clothes off his back. I told my mother that her tears were 20 years too late to wash away the memory of that driveway in Seattle I stood up and walked to the window, showing them the vastness of my holdings, and I told them that every single brick in this city that I owned was a testament to their failure as parents, because I didn't build this because of them, I built it in spite of them. I offered them a deal, then a cold clinical contract that would provide them with a tiny 1-bedroom apartment and a monthly allowance that would cover only the barest essentials, food and medicine, but it came with a condition: they had to sign a legal document renouncing any claim to the family name and agreeing to never contact me or Maya again. I wanted them to be as dead to me as I had been to them for all those years. My father's face twisted in a mixture of rage and relief because his survival instinct was stronger than his ego, and he grabbed the pen and signed it before my mother could even finish her latest sob story. They took the blood money and left, and as I watched them walk toward the elevator, I realized that the last tether of my old life had snapped. I was truly alone at the top, but it was a glorious solitude. I spent the next year expanding into international markets, my influence spreading like a shadow across the globe, while I watched the small-town news from afar to see the final chapters of their lives play out. Maya had tried to sue me for a portion of the estate, claiming emotional distress, but I had the best lawyers in the country dismantle her case in 48 hours, and I countersued her for the original theft of my savings account until she was forced to declare bankruptcy and move into the very apartment I had provided for our parents. She was now a servant to the people who had spoiled her, and the irony was a vintage wine that I savored every evening. The revenge was no longer a loud screaming thing, it was a quiet hum in the background of a life lived with absolute power. I had replaced the boy who wanted love with a man who commanded empire, and as the sun set on the 4th year of my reign, I prepared for the final act of my plan, because I didn't just want them to be poor. I wanted to buy the very land where our old house stood and tear it down to build a park for orphan children, a place where no child would ever feel like a ghost in their own home. The demolition was scheduled for the next morning, and I wanted to be the one to swing the first hammer against the walls that once held my pain and their lies. The morning of the demolition was crisp and clear, the kind of day that felt like a fresh page in A book that had been soaked in blood and ink for too long. I arrived at the old neighborhood before the sun was fully up, watching the shadows retreat from the street where I was once cast out like a broken toy. The neighbors who used to look away when my father yelled now peered through their curtains with wide eyes, wondering why a fleet of black SUVs and heavy machinery was parked in front of the rotting corpse of the Sterling estate. I stood on the sidewalk wearing a simple black coat, no longer needing the armor of an expensive suit because the power was now inside me, not on me. I watched as the crane lowered its massive head, and the workers waited for my signal. I saw a small figure standing across the street. It was Maya, her hair unkempt and her face gaunt, looking at the house that represented the only time she was ever truly happy, because it was the time she was stealing my life. She didn't come closer, she just stood there shivering in the cold, a living ghost of a dead legacy. I didn't feel hatred when I looked at her. I felt nothing, which was the greatest victory of all. My parents were gone, hidden away in the small apartment I paid for, too ashamed to show their faces in a neighborhood that now knew they were frauds and failures. I climbed onto the platform of the lead excavator and felt the cold steel of the controls under my hands. The foreman looked at me with a questioning glance, and I simply nodded my head, giving the order to begin. The first blow struck the master bedroom, the place where they used to sit and plan their vacations while I worked in the rain. The wood splintered and the glass shattered with a sound like 1,000 screams echoing the pain I had carried for 20 years. I swung the bucket again and again, watching the walls collapse and the roof cave in, burying the framed photos of Maya's graduation and the ribbon she never earned. I felt a weight lifting from my chest with every brick that fell into the dust. The kitchen where I went hungry while they feasted was pulverized into gray powder. The hallway where I was told I was nothing was erased from the map of the world. It took only 3 hours to turn the monument of my misery into a pile of rubble, and as the dust settled I stood in the center of the lot, looking at the bare earth beneath my feet. The ground was neutral now. It didn't belong to Leonard Sterling or his favored daughter. It belonged to me, and I had already signed the deed over to a foundation that would build a sanctuary for kids who had been discarded by the world. I looked across the street one last time, but Maya was gone, leaving only a footprint in the frost. I turned to my assistant, who was waiting with a phone and a stack of contracts for a new merger in London, and I realized that for the first time in my life I wasn't looking back. The revenge was complete, not because they were destroyed, although they were, but because they no longer had the power to make me feel small. I had built a mountain out of the stones they threw at me, and from the top I could see a horizon that was infinite and bright. I walked away from the site without a single backward glance as the construction crews began to pour the foundation for something beautiful and kind. The story of the rejected son was over, and the story of the man who conquered his own darkness was just beginning. They thought I was finished. They thought they had buried me, but they forgot that I was a seed, and the dirt they piled on me only gave me the strength to grow into a forest that would outlast them all. As I got into my car and drove toward the airport, I felt a strange and wonderful silence in my soul, because the debt was paid, the ledger was closed, and I was finally free to be whoever I wanted to be in a world that finally knew my name for all the right reasons. And as the city skyline faded in my rearview mirror, I whispered to the wind that I was finally home within myself. And that was the greatest empire of all.